Okay, here we are in part two of our final lecture. And so here we have Dennis Lehane's short story, Animal Rescue, which is our example of what I'm calling modern fiction. Now, a few lectures ago when we studied barn burning and Sonny's Blues, we discussed like the modern period or modernism. That's not what I mean. I mean like contemporary, like today. Like you read this story, you're like, oh, that's from the 21st century. There's no mistaking this story from being from a different century, um, not even the 20th century. It's clearly the 21st, so it's modern in that sense. Um, so, like, really, like, what I want to do here is give you example of the kind of stories people are writing today and the potential they have to be great. Because we've read a lot of what I would call great books this quarter, classics, right? Like King Lear is a great work. Um, and now I don't think Animal Rescue is on par with King Lear, for instance, but I do think it offers us something great. I do think there are some trends in more modern fiction that aren't necessarily great, but I think there's still greatness there as possible as well. And so I think we need, in terms of studying the evolution of genre throughout the millennia, I think we need to study a modern story before we finish out. And so while after this you'll hear my lecture on A Simple Heart or Un Course Simple, and that is very much my magnum opus lecture for the class, the one that's, my little baby, my little pet project I want you to hear before we end. And I think that Un Course Simple or A Simple Heart is like one of the greatest stories ever written, but a story that's power and meaning isn't necessarily clear until you really have read it as many times as I have. And so that's why I want to share my lecture with you. That's one kind of thing, and that's a good thing to end the class with. But Un Course Simple or A Simple Heart is probably not a story that's immediately accessible or appealing to you. So, and it's also feels very old. So I wanted, moving forward in time chronologically as we have within genres this quarter, I wanted to also in the final lecture give you something. In the final lecture, I wanted to give you something we haven't studied yet. So part one, lyric poetry. Part three, a complex narrative. Part two, a more modern, more recent narrative. And so here you have it. So, in that, because Dennis Lehane is this writer who, his first novel came out in the mid 90s, there's not a lot of biography here, say, compared to someone like William Faulkner. So, just a few quick things. He's from Boston, and I just love the way Boston as a setting plays a role in his fiction. And his parents were Irish immigrants, so he's only second generation in the U.S. and just that background of Ireland comes through really vividly a little bit here, more so in his other fiction. I have a feeling you might become a Dennis Lehane fan after this lecture, so I want to just give you a little bit more about him. You've probably heard of, read, or at least seen the film adaptations of his most famous and award-winning novels, Mystic River, Gone Baby Gone, and most recently Shutter Island, which they're all very good. Shutter Island in particular is a powerful, well-done adaptation of what is a great novel, and in the words of one critic writing about it, really just nails the topic, the subject of mental illness. The movie that came out a couple of years ago, Joker, people have called it this great depiction of mental illness, and to a degree it is, but I think Shutter Island, if you haven't seen it or read it, is a much better example, and so you should definitely read it or see it or both. And if I have the opportunity, I'm probably going to teach it in a class soon at EWU. He composed this story, Animal Rescue, in 2010, but it has kind of a unique history. It's his only short story, and it was adapted into a film in 2014. He actually wrote the screenplay to the film, but since the story is not that long, as you know, he had to actually expand it to make it into a film, which is very rare, right? Usually your films are adapted from longer novels, and so you have to condense, so he expanded it. But what he did after the film was then turn it into a novel. So there's like a novel based on the film, but he wrote it himself. He wrote the screenplay, he wrote all three, and so the novel is, because it's a full novel, it's even longer of the three versions. And so the version I'm giving you is the original short story, but it's just a unique history. No text is usually produced in this manner. and they're all great. I actually think the novel, some of the things he added weren't really necessary, but I think the movie expands on the short story in a great way, so you should definitely check it out if you have time. And I'll add, if you want to write on this story as your paper for the class, you could also watch the film or read the novel or both and talk about one of those. Probably most of you'd be interested in the film, and I think that's the best place to go. But if you're not finding enough to talk about for a paper with the story, you could watch the film and write your paper on it. But obviously I wasn't going to assign watching a film is, although I could have. Maybe that would have been a good idea as part of a lesson. But anyway, that's the unique history of how the story came about. The timing of when he wrote it in 2010 is important, though, because Boston used to have an ordinance regarding pit bull ownership. It was overruled in 2012, but at the time when he wrote this in 2010, it was still in effect. And so that plays a role here because there is a stereotype about pit bulls I'm sure many of you are aware of. And the shattering of stereotypes is an important theme in this story. And so I've taught this story several times over the years. I actually had a student write a really great paper on it where she actually looked up all this information about Boston's ordinance regarding pit bull ownership and did a great paper on how, like, this story is a great critique of the stereotypes about pit bulls and the issues with that law, that ordinance. So there's a lot here to unpack from this little story. So what threads are we going to pull on as we unpack it? As I mentioned before, it's an example of modern or contemporary, or to be really specific, 21st century fiction. I want you to see an example of that before we conclude our study of genre and engage with it. What do you think of it? What does it have to offer? What are its limitations? Literary versus genre fiction. I talked about this before when we studied The Fall of the House of Usher, which was kind of a horror story. This is very much in the crime or thriller genre, kind of a crime thriller. And many scholars argue that genre fiction doesn't ask the big questions, doesn't teach the great lessons, doesn't engage on a existential or metaphysical level to the same degree as what they call literary fiction, because they argue if you're trying to write to appease the audience of a certain genre, to please people who are looking for a good thriller or a good mystery, for instance, you're inherently, by following those standards, limiting yourself. I don't agree with this argument. I think there are many ways literary fiction is superior, but I think genre fiction has a lot to offer. And I think this story is a wonderful example that treads the line between both. And so that'll definitely be one of my discussion board questions as well, is how does this story blur the lines between genre and literary fiction, and what as genre fiction does it have to offer to us? Obviously, central to this story is human and animal relationships. I've always been fascinated by and those of you who've taken classes with me, especially last quarter before, know this, but I think human and animal relationships and animals in literature are just fascinating. And I think this story, the part of the brilliance of it is what Cassius the dog teaches us about Bob, about ourselves. Part of that is the shattering of stereotypes. Bob is a guy we tend to see one way. We have a lot of preconceived notions about pit bulls. Through Cassius, we learn there's much more to pit bulls and much more to Bob than we initially think. The story very much ends with an open denouement. We talked about this before in Sonny's Blues, but denouement is the closure. So is the closure open or closed? Is it ambiguous or not? This is pretty ambiguous. It's not a nicely tied up ending. I think Lehane is doing that for a specific purpose. We'll pursue that. One way we'll pursue it through is the idea of control. The last line of the story is you couldn't control things. What does that mean? We started with Oedipus. Oedipus really couldn't control things. Oh boy, did he try, and he couldn't control things. Bob can't control things here either. But why is that an important lesson for him to learn? Why does Lehane want that to be the last thing we encounter as we finish the story? Finally, justice outside of the law. Eric is a bad guy. I think we're all probably moderately happy with what happens to him. But this is not the classic story of like the really obvious hero going out and getting vengeance against the guy who like murdered his whole family or something. It's not that kind of a story. But you have people who pretty much all of the characters here are operating outside the boundaries of the law. Now, the law already came up when we were talking about pit bulls in Boston. And so Lehane, the author, is doing something here with people who operate outside the law. And you can argue that there's a higher sense of justice. There's a sense of justice in which it makes sense for Bob to kill Eric and for Nadine, or for Nadia to be with Bob, even though he's killed her and she's quasi-reluctant about it. But at the same time, Bob is not a hero. He's at best an anti-hero, if that. And like the relationship at the end of the story is not an ideal one. And so Lehane isn't saying that we should seek justice outside the law, but he's perhaps, I think, gesturing to a greater sense of justice that can't always be found within the boundaries of the law. I think it applies to pit bulls. It applies to Bob. But that doesn't mean that he's a great guy or that we should just shirk the law. And so to me, this story connects very well with Martin Luther King's idea of just and unjust laws. And so I think there's a great deal we can learn from Bob and we can learn from Cassius, but it's complex. We have to suss it out, and that's what makes for great fiction. Pull on these threads and read some quotes. Of course, I'm going to start with what are your impressions of Bob, because I said stereotypes are important, so we have a certain idea of who Bob is. And I think part of the brilliance of this story is how our idea of Bob changes as we read it. So let's look at the very first passage describing him. It was just after Thanksgiving, the neighborhood gone quiet, hung over. After bartending at Cousin Marv's, Bob sometimes walked the streets. He was big and lumpy, and hair had been growing in unlikely places all over his body since his teens. In his 20s, he'd fought against the hair, carrying small clippers in his coat pocket and shaving twice a day. He'd also fought the weight. But during all those years of fighting, no girl who wasn't being paid for it ever showed any interest in him. After a time, he gave up the fight. He lived alone in the house he grew up in, and when it seemed likely to swallow him up with its smells and memories and dark couches, the attempts he'd made to escape it through church socials, large lodge picnics, and one horrific mixer thrown by a dating service had only opened the wound farther, left him patching it back up for weeks, cursing himself for hoping. So who is this guy? What do we think of him? Well, a few things. I mean, obviously, he's not physically appealing in the classic sense. And so the passage is operating on one level there. And that's clearly led to loneliness. But the loneliness has led to other things. And so there's a sense of he can't quite escape his past. He can't quite break out of his routine. He almost seems like a guy, I wouldn't say he's scared of his own shadow, but he's haunted by it. It's hanging over him. But he takes these walks. Why does he take these walks? Perhaps he's just hoping something, anything, will happen. And then it does. He finds a dog, and the dog changes everything. But this is what we think of Bob at the start of the story. We think of him as a guy who is big and unappealing and awkward and overshadowed by his own troublesome past and shadow. So what happens to him after he finds his dog? Well, you've read the story, so I don't know why these aren't flying in. Sorry about that. So I don't have to summarize it for you, but basically he, starts to have kind of a quasi-relationship with Nadia, since he finds the dog outside her place. But then we learn the dog's owner is Eric, who is just this awful guy who's abusive, and he clearly abused Nadia, and that's why he left the dog outside her place. And then there's this tension. Something's going to happen. He wants the dog back or a lot of money for Bob. He's getting kind of a hold over Bob, right? Like if Bob gives him the money, what else is he going to give him next? And he's also kind of a braggart. He's talking about how he killed this kid, Richie Whalen. Richie Whalen, who's not even in the story, died years before it started, becomes very important. And this is where this question here has to do with the genre of the story. This is where Lehane bells a suspense. I mean, obviously it's a crime story because it has murder, corruption, robbery, gambling, etc., but it's also a thriller. And here's the thriller part of it. So this is a passage, and I just have kind of a quote from a longer passage that the longer passage really shows us where we see the genre, the thriller part, but we see also kind of it crosses over into the literary part. So here the tension's really building. Bob's been slowly asking Eric all these questions, and this is brilliantly done. And if you see this in the film, I actually watched the film before I read the story. The way the actor, who I had on the first slide, Tom Hardy, who's one of my favorite actors, you probably know him, the way he delivers this is just perfect. And the way it builds, Eric's like tuning him out. He's not listening, but Bob's speech just keeps building up and building up. Finally, when he uses the word killed, this is what happens. After he uses the word killed, Bob could feel Nadia's eyes lock on him suddenly, her head cock a bit. That way he could never say he paid off Marv, and no one else could either. Marv uses the money to cover all the holes. He cleans up his act. It's like it never happened. So that's what we did. You did Eric barely in the conversation, but some warning in his head starting to sound, his head turning from the clock toward Bob. Killed him in my basement, Bob said. Know what his name was? I wouldn't know, Bob. Sure you would. Richie Whalen. So the twist of the story is Bob, the guy who seems overshadowed by his own shadow, is actually the one who killed Richie Whalen. In the story, is teased out more in the film and the novel. Richie Whalen's death is like this momentous occasion. It's kind of like this mythology that hangs over the story, and you never know who killed him. Different people claim to, but it turns out Bob, of all people, we wouldn't think was necessarily capable, killed him. It's this great twist. It builds up to it here, and all of a sudden, Eric, who's been seeming to have the power over Bob, realizes he's in the same room as a killer, and in the next paragraph, Bob kills him. So this is where we really see the thriller aspect of the story. This is where it feels like it's part of that genre. And this is very enjoyable, right? If you like suspense, if you like thrillers, the way the tension builds up here. But there's a lot more going on to it. You know, the thriller passage is like Eric barely in the conversation, but some warning in his head starting to sound. That's the thriller, the genre part of it. The literary part is before that. Bob could feel Nadia's eyes lock on him suddenly. That's where this kind of alludes to what will be the bigger theme, the bigger idea that makes it not just genre, but literary fiction. So why is it so important that Nadia's eyes? Well, we trust Nadia to a certain extent. Not to a great extent, but that her opinion of Bob, we seem to be able, it kind of corresponds to ours because of that first passage. He's an unappealing guy, right? Like Nadia's like been beat up and stuff, but she's a pretty girl. And so if she is interested in Bob, he must have something to offer her, something of value. What is it that he offers her? How is that complicated by the knowledge she gains in that passage I just quoted, where she learns he's a killer, and how does that play out at the end? Well, to understand that, we need Cassius. So I ask, how does your view of Bob change throughout the story, and what does Cassius teach us about Bob? Here's Bob's explanation for why he killed Eric. He would have just kept coming, Bob said. Once someone takes something from you and you let them, they don't feel gratitude. They just feel like you owe them more. He soaked them up in the bucket, wrung it out a bit, and slopped it over the main blood spot. It makes no sense, right? But that's how they feel, entitled. And you can never change their minds after that. She said, you just shot him? Bob swirled the mop over the spot. He beat my dog. I mean, that phrase, he beat my dog, sums the story up in a nutshell, right? Like I said, there's appeal to a greater sense of justice outside of the law of Eric is an abuser. He's abused Nadia. He's abused the dog. that pattern of abuse is going to continue. If Bob gives him the money, he'll just ask for more money. Bob, Nadia, and the dog will never be free unless Bob kills him. In the film, I think he actually says there he was going to take our dog. I think he also says he beat my dog. He says both. So there's this idea of Bob, Nadia, the dog, right? He's protecting all of them when he kills Eric. So on the one hand, we see why it seems like he needs to kill Eric. But on the other hand, there's Nadia. She says, you just shot him. You just did it. Like, she can't believe she's in the room and he just kills this guy. She's been abused. She's seen a lot, but she's probably never just been in a room where someone just very coldly and calculatingly just takes the life of another human being. Like, as bad as Eric is, we shouldn't downplay what Bob just did. And so you've got those two things in tension. He beat my dog in tension with emphasis on just shot him. That's why there's you just ... Lehane wants us to pause there. Let that sink in, that you just did it. Like, it's not that you shot him. It seemed to be an easy decision, that there was like no tension in it for you. You just did it with he beat my dog. The rationale versus the sheer kind of shock of the action of killing another person. So how do we reconcile these two things? Nadia has a decision to make. Can she be with Bob or not? And she says, her rationale when he says, why are you with me? She says, because you're nice to Cassius. And in the film, this is done in a great way, where after he kills Eric, in the final scene of the film, he shows up at Nadia's, and it's kind of this tension. Is she still going to be with him or not? And as she's looking at him, trying to decide, she keeps looking at Cassius, and the dog is not scared of Bob at all. And that seems to be the deciding factor. And that comes through in the story when she says she's scared that he would maybe hurt her, and he says, never, never, never. So there seems to be a distinction for Bob. He can easily kill Eric, no problem. But he would never even think of harming Nadia or the dog. And that's the difference between Bob and Eric. But that's not a simple thing we just arrive at easily, right? There's still this whole issue of he just kills this guy. So Lehane doesn't want things to just rest easily with us. He's pushing us, getting us to think. And so there's this very open denouement at the end of the story. And there's kind of a whole other thread with that, where we ask, what is the lesson that Bob learns from Cassius by the end of the story, and that Lehane wants us to learn? When they reached the center of the park, he unhooked the leash from Cassius's collar and reached into his coat for a tennis ball. Cassius reared his head. He snorted loud. He pawed the earth. Bob threw the ball, and the dog took off after it. Bob envisioned the ball taking a bad bounce into the road, the screech of tires, the thump of metal against dog, or what would happen if Cassius, suddenly free, just kept running. But what could you do? You couldn't control things. Bob, his whole life, he's only known loneliness. He's never known the kind of companionship he has with Cassius and with Nadia. Those things could go away in any instance. Cassius could get hit by a car. He could just keep running. Nadia could decide at any moment up and leave him. How could he ever be with her, be good to her, be truly comfortable with her, if he's worried that at any minute she might leave, because that's a real possibility? We can't control things. So what do we have if we can't control things? I'm a very controlling person. I always want to control things, but I've learned since having kids and other things, this is very true. You can't control things. I mean, we've been learning this since Oedipus. But what does Oedipus learn, right? Oedipus is supposed to be this great, ending, this catharsis where he's this incredibly prideful guy. He's completely broken, has lost everything, but gained humility. And that's the catharsis at the end of Oedipus. So what is the catharsis here? You couldn't control things. Well, there's a freedom in that, right? If he accepts that he can't control whether Nadia stays or whether Cassius stays, he just has to take on faith that they will, or that what is good for him will happen. Then he can rest easy, rest in those relationships, enjoy those relationships. If you try to control them, if you're worried about the things you love going away, you'll never be at peace with them. And so you have to accept that you couldn't control things. You have to put your faith in that, and from it, gain a sense of freedom. It's only possible for Bob to learn this, for us to learn this, through Cassius. So what could you talk about on the discussion board for this instance of modern fiction? Well, modern fiction. What makes Animal Rescue truly like a 21st century story? This doesn't belong in the other century. And so what makes it uniquely modern? What does it offer that pretty much everything else we've read is pretty old? If the next most recent thing was Sonny's Blues, then everything else we've read is pretty old. So, what does this offer us that maybe the older text couldn't offer us? But what are some things in those older texts that you appreciated that maybe aren't present here? And which do you prefer? Would you rather have read more things like Animal Rescue as opposed to just one thing like Animal Rescue itself? Or would you rather read these more classic, more traditionally great books, even though I certainly call this a great book in its own way? In which style? So that's one level of the question, is which older or more recent do you prefer to read on your own, but then which do you think is better for university classes like this one? In other words, next go around, should I assign more things like Animal Rescue or not? Why? The next debate here is literary versus genre fiction. So I talked at great length about how this is firmly in the crime or thriller genre. Does it transcend that? Does it give us something deeper, something greater that could put it into that category of great books? Books meaning very broadly poems, dramas, actual novels. So what are the limits as well as the benefits of genre fiction? Scholars argue it's limiting, but even if we look at it as genre fiction, even if we say it doesn't transcend the genre, should we still teach it in the classroom? Why? Now, dealing with the story itself, I mean, those two questions deal with the story, but more with kind of where does the story belong, and bigger questions about personal reading experience in the classroom. Dealing more directly with the content of the story, Bob's character. He's really complicated, and it's hard what to think of him, right? Should he be in jail? What do we think of a guy who is just willing to kill people if he sees that it's right? If he sees they violated this higher moral code to which he subscribes, even though he doesn't subscribe to the legal code we're all supposed to follow. So like, what do you think of him? Maybe he should be in jail. Maybe you think he's a great hero. Maybe your reading falls somewhere in between there, which is most likely. But what do you think of him? And again, most of this comes through Cassius. So the fact that Cassius trusts Bob is important. And this is the same kind of idea we get in Rook's poetry with the panther and the swan, and the same kind of idea you'll see with the bird that shows up in Encore Simple or Simple Heart in part 3, that animals can teach us a great deal about ourselves. And I say factor the title of the story into this question if you can. Potentially you don't have to. Because Animal Rescue, he rescues Cassius, right, out of the garbage can. But who is the animal, Bob or Cassius? And who rescues whom? Like with Rook's animals, sometimes we have to go down to get back up. Finally, you couldn't control things. What does that mean? Like, what does it really mean? And why does Lehane want us to learn this? How can we only learn it because of Cassius? Would this lesson, you couldn't control things, have the same effect if it were just Bob teaching it to us and not Cassius? So I hope you enjoyed this example of a much more modern style of fiction and can see how we get a lot from it with these questions. Looking forward to reading what you have to say about these questions.